Welcome to the latest instalment of Close Readings. In this series, we've been considering a sequence of poems that, it seemed to us, had a claim to be thought of as political, perhaps because they marked real historical events of political consequence, or because they articulated a particular ideology or a political vision, or because they had been read politically, whatever their author's intention might have been. My name is Seamus Perry and I teach English at Balliol College in Oxford, and I'm talking to Mark Ford, poet, critic, Professor of English at UCL. And today's poem is a sequence, a poem sequence by Seamus Heaney, Station Island, published in 1984. And I think we're conscious, aren't we, Mark, that this is possibly a slightly tangential poem to include within our run, because it's not absolutely clear that it's a political poem at all. In some ways, it seems to be a poem all about getting out of a political situation which is so horribly and exhaustingly political that it becomes unbearable.
Yes, but in the process of escaping from that situation, he delineates it in extremely powerful and moving terms, particularly when in the middle of the poem we learn about those murdered in the Troubles, such as William Strathern or his second cousin, Colin McCartney. So it certainly traces the Troubles, and it does so from the position of someone who was often called upon to make some political comment that, as Heaney became more and more famous, particularly in the wake of North of 1975 and his celebration by such as Helen Vendler in America, Heaney was becoming the most famous poet on the planet. He hasn't won the Nobel Prize by the time of Station Island, but he's still a real celebrity, and he's in a really difficult situation in terms of how he should channel or model or respond to the sectarian murders which are happening all the time. And he was brought up a Catholic, and this is I think you can think of Catholicism, though not all listeners will perhaps agree that Catholicism is one of the most successful political ideologies that the world has ever invented, in terms of it makes people interpret the world in relation to a particular kind of vision of Christian beliefs. So oddly, Station Island, though, which assumes the form of a pilgrimage, a Catholic pilgrimage, is also one undertaken, as the poem develops it, as a means of escaping some of the limitations, the reductiveness of Catholicism, indeed in some ways liberating Heaney himself from religion. And at the end, he famously kind of has James Joyce, that great anti-Catholic proselytizer, take his hand and tell him that this pilgrimage he shouldn't have bothered.
So we should fill in some of the background, shouldn't we? Station Island, I'm sure many listeners will know this already, but Station Island is a real place. It's in Lough Derg in County Donegal, and it's actually quite close to the border with Northern Ireland. So if there is a kind of a background in the poem to the Troubles, then that physical proximity itself is quite interesting. It is a site of pilgrimage, and a really deeply Irish site of pilgrimage, it should be said, not just because it's in County Donegal, but also because the person who establishes the holy site is St. Patrick himself, as part of his long struggles to convert the Irish to the truths of Christianity. He discovers in an island on Lough Derg an entrance to purgatory, as a way of persuading the Irish that the sorts of things he's saying about the afterlife are true. And we know, don't we, that Heaney went on this pilgrimage himself 3 times when he's an undergraduate.
Yes.
And the narrative structure of his poem is kind of loosely based on the stations of the pilgrimage that you would do if you went to Lough Derg for those 3 days.
Yes, there's the actual pilgrimages, and there's also the most famous pilgrim of all, Dante, who is kind of modelled or creates kind of scaffolding for the poem from the beginning to the end, and the encounters that Heaney has with the various revenants are very similar to those that Dante has in Inferno and Purgatorio. So complicating the kind of Irish perspective is that of the Divine Comedy. And it's a big challenge that Heaney takes on. You don't quote from the Divine Comedy kind of lightly. It's a fairly major work. And one of the ambitious aspects, I think, of this poem, which is so impressive, is the way it kind of responds to the challenge, not only of Dante, but I think of T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding as well, that again is a Dantescan poem, which is in the background of Station Island.
Yeah, and of all the bits of Dante that most matter to him, it's Purgatorio, isn't it? It's Purgatory, as is true for Eliot in his poem as well. Absolutely. So it's a poem about spiritual progression, which is what, unlike hell, because you're damned there forever, unlike heaven, because you've arrived, Purgatory has a narrative to it, doesn't it? If you're engaged in your purgatorial experiences properly, then one by one your sins drop away from you, and you improve, you get better. So it's the kind of an educative sort of background to Heaney's poem.
Yes, and he called it an exorcism. That writing this poem was like an exorcism. That he was blocked, he was stuck, he was paralysed by the competing political calls on his attention, or he was stretched in various different ways and was stymied, and that it was a necessary poem for him to write. He talks about this in Stepping Stones, that brilliant book-length interview he does with Dennis O'Driscoll, about Station Island being absolutely kind of crucial for him to write it, to be able to move on. Yeah. And to that extent, it's modelling the Heaney persona, which has always been, certainly from Wintering Out onwards, involved with the politics of Ireland. I mean, no Irish poet can very long escape the tensions, paradoxes and contradictions of the political situation in Ireland. And Heaney, in the North poems in particular, he'd been criticised by some as giving in too much to kind of tribal revenge, to a kind of tribal Catholicism. And this poem, he's very clearly attempting to free himself from some of those expectations and to find the Heaney persona as a writer rather than somebody who could be seen as in any way somebody who should pronounce on political events.
Yes, absolutely. But also, I mean, conscious of Yeats, I suppose, as a precursor, a writer who has that kind of imaginative freedom while still being aware of the responsibilities that are entailed by your historical situation.
Yeah, and that's why the concept of Station Island is so brilliant. It's a dream vision. It actually, in that way, it's a bit like Langland's Piers Plowman, that it's a dream vision which can somehow take the state of the nation at the same time as it's also an autobiographical poem, that all the people he meets from his past have been key figures, going back to his teacher at Anna Horish, back to an archaeologist friend of his who died at the age of 32.
Early Pash.
Yes, his sort of sexual awakening. It really is an autobiographical poem, and the politics, I think, are in some ways subsumed into his saying, actually, it's okay for me to write an autobiographical poem a la Wordsworth because I'm a poet rather than a political figure, and that in its own way, there is an act of defiance in concentrating so much on his own development and experiences. So it is a mini prelude poem in that way.
Okay, so let's maybe go through some of the great episodes of this really wonderful poem, I think. Maybe one other thing to mention in the background of this is Heaney's great interest in the Irish mythological figure of Sweaney. He writes, produces a sort of translation, doesn't he, of the great Irish epic about King Sweaney, which he publishes just before Station Island and calls it Sweaney Astray. And the story of Sweaney, just very, very briefly, is that he's a king who is conjured into being a bird and then flies around the countryside and is mad. So he's completely opted out of, as it were, all the political or governmental responsibility of kingship and has become as innocent as a natural creature singing at the top of its voice, like Shelley's Skylark or something like that. And this is clearly something in this that Heaney is deeply, deeply attracted to. And it's interesting, I suppose, with that Sweaney in the back of our minds, that the first person he encounters in Station Island is someone whose surname is Sweaney. And Sweaney tells him to drop the whole pilgrimage nonsense because it's all a complete waste of time.
Simon Sweaney, who was an actual figure,
a real person, yes,
from Heaney's childhood, and becomes a kind of template for the vagrant poet figure that he'd like to be. He was also quite sort of anti-religious, this Sweaney. He's the one who throws St. Ronan's Psalter into the lake, which is alluded to in a later section of Station Island. So Sweaney certainly operates for Heaney in that opening section, which has this sort of dream vision-y feel. It's a Sunday, there's a whole procession of women, as in a kind of Dantescan scene, moving towards their pilgrimage. He gets caught up in them, but Simon Sweaney sort of says, he just is conjured up as an early memory. So we're starting as well, the extent to which the poem is a poem about memory.
Yeah.
This early memory of Simon Sweaney, who was a slightly scary outlaw. He calls him a tinker. It's in inverted commas in the poem, but we'd call him a traveller now. And Heaney talks about how many of these travellers were around where he was growing up in Derry. And they were sort of both scary but also attractive and appealing in their outlaw lives.
Because their outlawishness or their outlawdom or whatever the right noun is a sign of their independence, isn't it? And their autonomy and their individuality. That seems to be what he values.
And closeness to the land as well, that they're connected to the land. We first see Simon Sweaney soaring at a bit of wood, so that they are connected to the land. And that has always been one of the great strengths and one of the dominant myths of Heaney's own poeticness, is his connection to the landscape.
Yes. But very deeply sort of pastoral vision, isn't it? That's right. I was a fasted pilgrim, Heaney says in section 1, light-headed, leaving home to face into my station. Stay clear of all processions, Sweaney shouted at me. But the murmur of the crowd and their feet slushing through the tender bladed growth had opened a drugged path I was set upon. So absolutely a setting up an antithesis between kind of collective crowd experience, which is what he signed up to, and a kind of, in some ways, a more authentic kind of individual experience, which is what, as you say, in the end, he's going to be pointed towards.
Yes, I think drugged is very interesting there as well, that somehow we are entering that space in which he kind of surrenders his autonomy and sees where it gets him. And that is actually part of the poet's compositional process in some ways, to surrender to forces beyond him. And that's what he's sort of daring himself to do in this. But at the same time, he always has to kind of recover his balance at certain moments, so he doesn't get caught up in the collective experience of religious belief.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Political Poems, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. You can listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series by signing up to our close reading subscription. Go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.